May 13th, 1943, Tunisia. Panzer Grenadier Hans Brenner crouched in the turret of his disabled Panzer IV, watching American Sherman tanks roll past in the dust. His hands shook as he raised them above his head. For weeks, the propaganda broadcasts from Berlin had been crystal clear. The Americans were barbarians, vengeful, cruel. Torture awaited anyone who fell into their hands. He climbed down from the tank, his Afrika Korps uniform stained with oil and North African sand. Around him, thousands of German and Italian soldiers were doing the same, surrendering en masse as the Tunisian campaign collapsed. 275,000 men, the entire Afrika Korps, Rommel's legendary desert fighters, now prisoners of an enemy they'd been taught to despise and fear. An American soldier approached, rifle lowered. Hans braced himself. This was the moment. The beating, the deprivation, the savagery promised by every German radio broadcast for the past 2 years. Instead, the American handed him a canteen. Water. Clean, cool water. Then came a rectangular cardboard box. A K-ration. Hans tore it open with trembling fingers and found crackers, processed cheese, a fruit bar, candy, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. He stared at the contents, his mind struggling to reconcile what he held with what he'd been told to expect. This was just food, field rations, the kind of casual abundance that had vanished from Wehrmacht supply lines years ago, and the Americans were giving it to their prisoners, not as a reward, not as a trick, just as a procedure, standard operating practice for the United States Army. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mechanics of Hans Brenner's disbelief began 3 years earlier in the Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Joseph Goebbels had crafted a narrative with surgical precision. America, he proclaimed, was a mongrel nation, racially impure, culturally degenerate, industrially chaotic. Its army was undisciplined, its soldiers soft and cowardly. Most critically, Americans had no capacity for the kind of organized efficiency that defined the German military. They couldn't feed their own troops properly, let alone their prisoners. The propaganda served a dual purpose. It encouraged German soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender, and it prepared the home front for the inevitable shortages that came with total war. If the enemy was weak and disorganized, then Germany's own privations could be blamed on the scale of conflict, not on systemic failures in the Reich's war economy. Hans had absorbed these lessons during his training with the 21st Panzer Division. Before the war, he'd been a machinist from Stuttgart, skilled with lathes and precision instruments. The Wehrmacht valued technical men for the Panzer Corps, and Hans had proven himself capable with the mechanical systems that kept the tanks running in the brutal conditions of North Africa. He'd served under Rommel for 2 years, from the initial victories at Gazala to the grinding retreat after El Alamein. During those 2 years, the food situation in the Afrika Korps had deteriorated steadily. German supply lines across the Mediterranean were under constant attack from British naval forces and aircraft based in Malta. Fuel and ammunition took priority over rations. The standard German field ration centered on black bread, hard and dense, supplemented by the goulash cannoni, a mobile field kitchen that delivered hot soup when logistics permitted. The soup rarely contained visible meat. Potatoes and beans formed the bulk of nutrition, stretched thin across thousands of hungry men. By 1943, even these meagre rations were arriving irregularly. Hans remembered days when his crew subsisted on the iron ration, the emergency package every soldier carried. It contained dried food concentrate and a small portion of chocolate meant to sustain life for 24 hours in desperate circumstances. They'd eaten their iron rations multiple times, not from being encircled by the enemy, but simply because the supply trucks hadn't arrived. The contrast with what the Americans provided in those first hours of captivity was staggering. At the processing camps hastily established near Tunis, U.S. Army field kitchens served the German prisoners pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and milk. Hans watched in stunned silence as American cooks prepared breakfast for thousands of prisoners with the casual efficiency of men following routine. There was no ceremony to it, No performance of generosity. This was simply how the Americans fed people. An officer from the International Red Cross arrived to document conditions. A German-speaking Swiss inspector walked through the rows of prisoners, clipboard in hand, recording testimony. Hans heard another Panzer crewman from the 15th Panzer Division speaking to the inspector, his voice carrying the distinctive Berlin accent. "We expected to be starved," the tanker said. "That's what they told us would happen. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had." This confusion about American resources began our education. Education, that was the word that stuck in Hans's mind as American soldiers herded him and several thousand other prisoners toward the docks at Bizerte. They were being shipped across the Atlantic, transported to prison camps in the United States itself. Hans tried to imagine it, the heartland of the enemy, the place where American industrial power originated. Everything he'd been taught suggested it would be a wasteland of poverty and disorganization. The Liberty ship that carried them to America challenged every assumption. These vessels were being launched at a rate of one every 42 hours, a feat of industrial production that Hans, as a machinist, found difficult to comprehend. The ship itself was clean, well-maintained, and enormous. It smelled of fresh paint and engine oil, not the rust and decay of overused equipment. More astonishing was the food. Naval records from ships carrying prisoners in June and July 1943 confirmed that German POWs received rations equivalent to the American crew, approximately 3,500 calories per day. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee with real sugar. The ship's refrigeration systems, standard equipment on American vessels, kept this abundance fresh throughout the 2-week crossing. Hans ate his first meal aboard ship in silence, methodically chewing roast beef while his mind raced. 3,500 calories per day. That was more than a frontline German soldier received during the best periods of the war. That was more than many German civilians back home had seen in 2 years. And the Americans were serving it to prisoners, to the enemy. On the 4th of July, the ship's cook brought out an ice cream maker. Hans watched the machine churn out 10-gallon batches of frozen dessert and felt something crack in the foundation of his worldview. Ice cream. In the middle of the ocean. In the middle of a war. This wasn't a necessity. This wasn't even efficient. This abundance was so casual it bordered on waste. A submariner from the Kriegsmarine, captured when his U-boat was sunk off Gibraltar, stood next to Hans at the rail. The sailor had been at sea for most of the war, and his gaunt frame testified to months of submarine rations. He held a bowl of vanilla ice cream in both hands as if it might vanish. "They have machines for this," the submariner said quietly. "Machines dedicated to making frozen cream and sugar, not for officers, not for special occasions, just because they can." Hans nodded. He'd seen the machine. He'd watched the American sailors operate it without any sense that they were doing something extraordinary. To them, ice cream on. The 4th of July was tradition, not luxury. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia, on a sweltering summer afternoon. Hans shuffled down the gangway with hundreds of other prisoners, blinking in the bright American sunlight. The Norfolk Naval Base sprawled across 4,300 acres of developed waterfront. Cranes moved constantly, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. In a single day, this port handled more tonnage than major German ports moved in a week. American guards directed the prisoners to a processing facility. Along the way, Hans saw shops and exchanges for dock workers. Through the windows, he glimpsed shelves heavy with consumer goods. Candy bars, Hershey, Mars, Nestle. Dozens of varieties, all available for a nickel, 5 cents. The same amount a child in Chicago would pay with their allowance. The scale of it was impossible. Not just that these goods existed, but that they existed in such quantity that they could be sold for trivial sums to ordinary workers. This wasn't the privilege of party members or military officers. This was the baseline standard of American civilian life. The train journey inland provided more evidence. Hans and his fellow prisoners travelled in passenger coaches, not cattle cars. They sat on padded seats and looked out proper windows at the American landscape rolling past. The guards served them fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee. Documented menus from July 1943 listed these exact items. This wasn't special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was simply how the United States Army transported people. Hans pressed his face to the window and watched America. Farms with full silos, towns with intact buildings, children playing in yards, not a single bomb crater, not one burned-out structure. The war had not touched this place. More than that, the war seemed to have enriched it. Factories were running at full capacity. Fields were producing abundant harvests. The infrastructure was not just functional but expanding. A Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over Sicily, sat across from Hans. The flyer had seen London burning, had dropped bombs on British cities, had witnessed the destruction of European urban centres. He stared out the window at the American heartland with an expression of profound confusion. "They're not fighting this war on rations," the pilot said. "They're fighting it on surplus." Camp Carson, Colorado, appeared through the haze of an August afternoon. The facility sprawled across hundreds of acres, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but the infrastructure was solid. Electric lights, running water, flush toilets, heated barracks with individual beds, each with a mattress, blanket, and pillow. Hans walked through the camp gate expecting squalor. He'd been prepared for that. Squalor made sense. Deprivation was logical. But this facility exceeded the standards of many Wehrmacht installations he'd served at during the war. The barracks were clean, well-maintained, and properly ventilated. The latrines functioned. The heating systems worked. This was not punishment. This was infrastructure. The camp exchange, the PX store, delivered the final blow to Hans's understanding of the war economy. Army quartermaster records from 1943 detailed the inventory available to prisoners: multiple brands of soft drinks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC, Cola, candy bars, and confections of every variety, ice cream available for purchase, cigarettes and tobacco, fresh fruit, even beer for enlisted prisoners. Prisoners earned 80 cents a day for labor, later raised to $1. With Coca-Cola and most candy bars priced at 5 cents, a single day's wages could purchase 16 items that Hans would have classified as unimaginable luxury in 1939, let alone in 1943. In Germany, these goods either didn't exist or required special connections to the Nazi Party, elite to obtain. Coca-Cola became the symbol that Hans couldn't rationalize away. In 1943 alone, the Coca-Cola Company produced 5 billion bottles. The US military had contracted to guarantee American servicemen a 5-cent Coke anywhere in the world, and that contract apparently extended to prisoners as well. The logistical infrastructure required to deliver carbonated beverages to every camp in the American Southwest was staggering. This wasn't food. This wasn't a necessity. This was a soft drink, and the Americans had built a distribution network to ensure every soldier and every prisoner could purchase it for a nickel. Hans bought his first Coca-Cola at the camp exchange on his third day at Carson. The glass bottle was slick with condensation in the Colorado heat. He twisted off the cap and watched bubbles fizz against the glass. The sweet, sharp carbonation exploded on his tongue, a sensation utterly disconnected from the gritty reality of North African combat, where he'd subsisted on hard bread and bitter coffee for 2 years. This was not just a drink, it was proof. Proof that American industrial capacity operated on a scale that German propaganda had declared impossible. Proof that the United States could afford to produce and distribute luxury goods even while fighting a two-front war. Proof that everything Hans had been taught about American weakness was a lie. He finished the Coke and held the empty bottle, turning it in his hands. Somewhere in Atlanta, workers were manufacturing syrup concentrate. Somewhere across America, bottling plants were receiving that concentrate and producing identical products. The quality control required to make a Coke taste the same in Colorado as it did in Maine represented a level of standardization that German industry had never achieved. Hans set the bottle down and walked back to his barracks, his thoughts churning. The camp around him hummed with routine. American guards patrolled the perimeter, without malice or excessive vigilance. German prisoners moved freely within the wire, organizing soccer games, establishing workshops, painting landscapes. The Geneva Convention governed everything, and the Americans followed it with bureaucratic precision. That night, lying on his mattress in the heated barracks, Hans stared at the ceiling and confronted an uncomfortable truth. The propaganda had been wrong, not in the sense of being slightly inaccurate or exaggerated. Wrong in its fundamental premise. America wasn't weak. America wasn't disorganized. America was operating on such abundant resources that it could afford to treat its prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers. The work details began in September. Hans was assigned to a farm labor crew in the sugar beet fields of northeastern Colorado. By 1944, nearly 100,000 German prisoners were working in American agriculture, filling the labor shortage created when American men went overseas to fight. The Geneva Convention permitted this, provided prisoners were paid and not used for work directly supporting the war effort. Hans climbed into a truck at dawn with 11 other prisoners. An American guard rode with them, his rifle propped casually against his knee. They drove through Colorado farmland in the early morning light, past fields that stretched to the horizon. The mechanization was immediate and obvious. Tractors, not horses, pulled the equipment. Irrigation systems fed the crops with engineering precision. The scale of American agriculture made German farming look medieval by comparison. The farmer who contracted for their labor was named Miller, a third-generation Colorado rancher with weathered hands and careful English. He provided lunch for the work crew, not prison rations but actual farm food, sandwiches with thick slices of ham, fresh tomatoes from his garden, lemonade with real sugar. His wife brought it out in the middle of the day, and Hans ate sitting, in the shade of a cottonwood tree, watching American abundance manifest in a farmer's casual generosity. Miller paid the U.S. government 45 cents per hour per prisoner. Hans netted 80 cents per day for himself, pocket money to spend at the camp canteen. It wasn't much, but it was more than many German civilians were earning in the collapsed economy back home. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Hans was a prisoner of war, and he was being paid to work in fields that produced more food than Germany's entire agricultural sector. During the harvest season, they picked sugar beets by hand, loading them into trucks that carried them to processing plants. Hans learned that American sugar production from both cane and beets reached nearly 7 million tons annually. 7 million tons. The source of the casual abundance in the camp mess halls was now visible, and it was vast. In Germany, sugar had become a tightly controlled commodity. Civilians received about 280 grams per month when it was available. In Camp Carson, sugar sat in open bowls on mess hall tables for unlimited use. The mathematics was devastating. Hans did the calculations in his head while pulling beets from the dark Colorado soil. The average German prisoner in America consumed between 3,300 and 3,600 calories daily. The average German civilian, according to letters that occasionally made it through the Red Cross, subsisted on 1,200 to 1,500 calories. The enemy in the prison camp ate better than the free citizens of the Reich. An incident at the camp bakery in October illustrated the chasm in thinking. Several 100 pounds of sugar had hardened into a solid block in the autumn humidity. Hans was assigned to kitchen duty that week and watched as the American cook examined the block, shrugged, and threw it in the waste bin, just discarded it, ordered more. Hans stood frozen, unable to process what he'd witnessed. In Germany, that sugar would have been steamed, chiseled, ground down, and recovered with painstaking effort. Here, it was trash. The cook noticed Hans staring and misread his expression. "Don't worry," the American said. "New shipment comes tomorrow. Always does. Always does." Those two words contained more information than a month of intelligence reports. The American supply chain was so reliable, so abundant, that waste was acceptable. More than acceptable, it was routine. The system could afford to discard hundreds of pounds of sugar because the replacement was already in transit. Hans returned to his barracks that night and found a letter waiting. It had taken 4 months to arrive, passed through multiple censors, but it was from his wife in Stuttgart. She wrote in careful, measured language, aware that military censors would read every word. Between the lines, Hans read deprivation, the ration cards that never had enough stamps, the queues that lasted hours for bread, the children who'd forgotten what butter tasted like. His wife didn't complain. She was too smart for that. But she asked, in the way wives asked, whether Hans was being treated well, whether he had enough to eat, whether the Americans were cruel. Hans sat on his bunk, letter in hand, and contemplated the impossible task of explaining the truth. How could he tell her that he was eating steak while she queued for turnips? How could he describe ice cream and Coca-Cola to someone who measured her family's survival in grams of rationed flour? He wrote back, carefully. The Geneva Convention is observed here. We are treated fairly. I have enough to eat. I am well. The censor would approve those sentences. They were factual and contained no military intelligence, but they were also grotesquely inadequate. The truth was that Hans was living in an abundance so casual it felt like mockery, while his family endured privations that the American guards couldn't even conceptualize. Thanksgiving arrived in November, 1943. Hans had heard of the holiday in school, back when learning English was still permitted before the war. It was an American celebration of harvest and gratitude, though the details had been vague. The camp commander announced that all prisoners would receive a traditional Thanksgiving meal. Army records confirmed that every POW camp in the United States served an identical feast: roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee and milk. Hans filed through the mess hall line with 2,000 other prisoners and received his plate. The turkey was real, properly roasted, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. The portions were generous, heaped on standard-issue metal trays. He sat at a long table with other men from the 21st Panzer Division and ate in silence. Around him, Germans who'd fought at Tobruk and El Alamein consumed a meal identical to what American soldiers were eating in camps across the world. The logistics of it were staggering. The US Army had coordinated the simultaneous preparation and serving of this exact meal to hundreds of thousands of prisoners and millions of servicemen worldwide. The organizational capacity required was beyond anything Hans had witnessed in the Wehrmacht. But more than that, the meal was a statement. The enemy received the same food as American soldiers. The racial hierarchy that Nazi doctrine proclaimed was fundamentally rejected by this simple act of equal provision. A Panzer commander from Hamburg sat across from Hans, carefully cutting his turkey into precise pieces. The officer had been a lawyer before the war, educated and articulate. He set down his fork and spoke quietly. "Do you understand what this means?" the commander asked. "They're not feeding us to be kind. They're feeding us because they can afford to, because their production is so vast that feeding the enemy doesn't even strain their resources. This meal isn't mercy. It's a demonstration of power." Hans nodded slowly. The commander was right. Every meal at Camp Carson was proof of American industrial supremacy. Every Coca-Cola, every candy bar, every unnecessary luxury demonstrated that the United States operated on such abundant surplus that it could afford to be generous with prisoners. Germany had fought this war on scarcity, stretching every resource, rationing every commodity. America fought on abundance, and abundance was winning. Christmas 1943 brought something Hans hadn't anticipated. Packages arrived from American civilians, church groups, civic organizations, and the American Friends Service Committee distributed tens of thousands of Christmas packages to German POWs across the country. Hans received a small cardboard box with his name written in careful English handwriting. Inside, he found homemade cookies, candy, toiletries, a small game, and cigarettes. The box had come from a Methodist church in Grand Junction, Colorado. A note inside, written by someone named Mrs. Peterson, wished the prisoners a peaceful Christmas and expressed hope for an end to the war. The handwriting was feminine, careful, and kind. Hans held the note and tried to imagine this woman. Did she have sons fighting overseas? Brothers? A husband? Yet she'd taken time to assemble a package for an enemy soldier, to wish him peace, to treat him with dignity. This voluntary kindness toward enemies struck at the core of everything Hans had been taught about American barbarism. The Nazi doctrine of racial hierarchy declared that such mercy was impossible, that inferior peoples lacked the capacity for compassion toward their betters. But there was evidence that the Americans felt secure enough, confident enough, to be generous to the men whose comrades were killing American soldiers in Italy and the Pacific. In towns near Camp Carson, local residents brought homemade treats directly to the camp gates. Hans saw them arrive. On Christmas Eve, ordinary Americans carrying baskets of cookies and small gifts. The guards accepted the donations and distributed them. No ceremony, no propaganda cameras, just civilian kindness expressed through small acts that the Germans had been told were impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late 1944, a profound reversal was underway. German prisoners, using their camp wages, began purchasing American goods and mailing them home. Coffee, chocolate bars, canned meat, soap, cigarettes. Items that had vanished from German stores were being sent by POWs to their families in the Reich. International Red Cross records confirmed that German prisoners in America sent approximately 11 million food parcels home during the war. Hans participated in this strange economy. Every month, he used his labor wages to buy goods at the camp canteen, package them for his wife in Stuttgart. The American postal system, even during wartime, reliably transported these packages across the Atlantic through Red Cross channels. His wife's letters confirmed their arrival, her words carefully praising the gifts from relatives, rather than explicitly stating that her husband, a prisoner in America, was providing better for his family than the German government could. The irony was devastating and undeniable. German soldiers in American captivity were providing for their families in German freedom. The propaganda had inverted completely. The weak, disorganized Americans were feeding the efficient, superior Germans. The racial hierarchy that justified the war had been demolished by the simple reality of who had food and who didn't. Hans watched other prisoners grapple with the same cognitive dissonance. Some, the hardcore Nazis who'd believed every word from Berlin, constructed elaborate rationalizations. This was psychological warfare, they insisted. American manipulation designed to weaken German resolve. The abundance was temporary, an illusion that would collapse once the prisoners were no longer useful for propaganda purposes. But most prisoners, the ordinary soldiers who'd been conscripted from farms and factories, couldn't maintain the delusion. The evidence was too consistent, too overwhelming. Medical examinations conducted by camp doctors showed that the average prisoner had gained weight in American captivity. Men who'd arrived malnourished from the North African campaign were returning to health on American rations. German soldiers were healthier as American prisoners than they'd been as German troops. Work details continued through the winter. Hans was assigned to a canning factory in January 1944, processing vegetables for civilian and military consumption. He watched as quality control inspectors rejected perfectly edible produce for minor cosmetic blemishes. Del Monte records from that period showed approximately 15% of fruits and vegetables were diverted to animal feed because they didn't meet appearance standards. Hans stood at his station, watching bruised apples roll into the waste bin, and felt the last remnants of his faith in German superiority crumble. In Germany, those apples would have been treasured, carefully processed, distributed to grateful civilians. Here, they were pig feed. The Americans could afford to feed blemished fruit to livestock because their agricultural production was so vast that only the perfect specimens needed to reach human consumers. The spring of 1944 brought news from Europe. The Allies were preparing for invasion. Prisoners gathered around radios in the camp recreation halls, listening to BBC broadcasts that the Americans permitted. Hans heard about the bombing campaigns, the strategic destruction of German industry and transportation. His hometown of Stuttgart was mentioned, repeatedly. The aircraft factories, the rail yards, the residential districts, all targets, all burning. He wrote to his wife, his letters becoming more urgent. Move to the countryside if possible. Take the children away from industrial areas. The censors allowed it. The advice was humanitarian, not military intelligence. But her responses, when they came months later, indicated that moving was impossible. There was nowhere to go. Relatives in rural areas were already overcrowded with refugees from bombed cities. The only option was to shelter in place and hope. By summer 1944, the character of new prisoners arriving at Camp Carson had changed. These were no longer Africa Corps veterans, hardened by desert warfare and still clinging to memories of early victories. These were men captured in Normandy, in Italy, in the grinding defensive battles where Germany fought from a position of weakness. They arrived with more realistic views of the war's trajectory. The faith that had sustained earlier prisoners had largely evaporated by the time these men were captured. Hans talked with a young grenadier captured on Omaha Beach. The boy was 19, conscripted in 1943, trained for 6 months, and thrown into combat against the Allied invasion. He'd fought for 3 days before surrendering, and his eyes held a hollow quality that Hans recognized from men who'd seen their worldview destroyed by direct experience. "They told us the invasion would fail," the grenadier said. "They said the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that American soldiers were cowards who would break at the first resistance." He laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "I watched them come off the landing craft into machine gun fire. They didn't break. They just kept coming. More men, more equipment, more of everything. We ran out of ammunition. They didn't." This was the essential truth that every German prisoner eventually confronted. The Americans had more. More food. More ammunition. More fuel. More vehicles. More aircraft. More ships. The quantitative advantage was so overwhelming that German tactical superiority, when it existed, couldn't compensate. You couldn't outfight an enemy who could replace every loss immediately while you scraped for replacement parts and rationed every bullet. The camp cinema showed American films on Saturday nights, Hollywood productions, translated with German subtitles, depicting American life before and during the war. Hans watched these films with the critical eye of a man trained to spot propaganda. But the propaganda, if that's what it was, lay in what the films took for granted. The casual abundance in the background, the well-stocked stores, the automobiles everyone seemed to own, the assumption of plenty that permeated every scene. One film showed an American family's Christmas celebration. The table was laden with food. The children received multiple gifts. The father casually smoked cigarettes without carefully, rationing each one. Hans knew this was Hollywood, not documentary footage, but the very fact that Americans could fantasize about such abundance while fighting a global war revealed the gap in resources. German films during wartime showed sacrifice, duty, noble suffering. American films showed interrupted prosperity, a temporary inconvenience before the inevitable return to comfort. As 1944 turned to 1945, the news from Europe became increasingly dire. The Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were pushing from the east. The Allies were crossing the Rhine. Hans received fewer letters from home. The postal service was breaking down. His last letter from his wife, dated December 1944, mentioned air raids almost nightly. She didn't say she was frightened, but he could read the fear between the lines. He lay in his heated barracks at Camp Carson, safe and well-fed, while his family huddled in shelters as bombs fell. The guilt was physical, a constant weight in his chest. Other prisoners felt it too. They'd walk the camp perimeter in the evening, smoking American cigarettes, talking quietly about the wives and children enduring what they'd been spared by capture. A Luftwaffe pilot captured in December 1944 articulated what many felt. "We're the lucky ones," he said. "We lost. We surrendered. And because of that, we're alive and fed while Germany burns. How do you reconcile that? How do you go home and face the people who suffered while you ate steak?" There was no good answer. Hans knew he would carry that guilt forever. But he also knew that the steak was real, the suffering was real, and the lessons learned in American captivity were profound. The Nazi promises of racial superiority had been disproven by the simple metric of who could feed their people. The claims of American weakness had been demolished by the reality of American production. The entire ideological foundation of the war had been revealed, as a lie, and the proof was served on a metal tray 3 times a day. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Hans heard the news from a camp guard who looked relieved rather than triumphant. The killing had stopped. That seemed to be what mattered most to the Americans. Not the satisfaction of victory, but the relief that the dying was done. The prisoners expected immediate repatriation. The Geneva Convention mandated that POWs be returned home promptly after hostilities ended. But practical reality intervened. Germany was in ruins. The transportation infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of displaced persons needed to be processed and relocated. The logistics of returning 400,000 German prisoners from America would take months, possibly years. In May 1945, the camp commanders announced changes. Food rations would be reduced, not to starvation levels, but to something closer to what German civilians were receiving. The abundant meat portions decreased. The camp canteen stopped selling many items. Fresh fruit became occasional rather than routine. The American government, facing domestic pressure from citizens who resented that POWs ate better than rationed American civilians, had decided to scale back the generosity. Hans noticed the difference immediately, not because the new rations were insufficient, but because they highlighted how abundant the previous treatment had been. Even though it was reduced, the food was adequate. Men didn't go hungry. The daily calorie count remained around 2,500, still more than most German civilians received. But the casual excess, the steaks and ice cream and unlimited coffee, disappeared. America was reminding its prisoners that the war was over and the special circumstances that had governed their treatment were ending. The camp commander also mandated that all prisoners watch documentary footage of the concentration camps. Hans filed into the camp theatre with hundreds of other prisoners and watched as American army cameramen showed what they'd found at Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, the emaciated bodies, the gas chambers, the systematic machinery of death. Hans had heard rumours during the war, whispers about camps in the east where undesirables were sent. He'd dismissed them as Allied propaganda, lies designed to demonize the Reich. Now, confronted with film evidence, he couldn't maintain the denial. The Americans wouldn't need to fabricate this. The documentation was too extensive, too consistent, too horrifying. Men wept in the theatre. Some refused to believe, insisting the footage was staged. But most, like Hans, felt the crushing weight of complicity. They'd fought for this regime. They'd believed the promises of German greatness, and the greatness had manifested as industrial-scale murder of civilians. The cognitive dissonance was total. How could the superior race, the culture that produced Goethe and Beethoven, also produce Auschwitz? An American officer stood before them after the films ended. "You will return to Germany," he said in careful German. "You will help rebuild your country, and you will remember what you saw here, both in these camps and in these films. You will tell your children the truth. That is your obligation now." Hans returned to his barracks in silence. Around him, men processed what they'd learned in different ways. Some descended into depression, some clung to denial. Hans felt a desperate need to understand how his country had gone so catastrophically wrong. The Americans had defeated Germany not through cruelty but through abundance. They'd shown mercy where the Reich had shown murder. The contrast was stark enough to be unbearable. The repatriation process began in earnest in the spring of 1946. Hans received his notice in April. After 3 years in American captivity, he would finally return home. The prospect filled him with equal measures of hope and dread. He was going back to a wife he hadn't seen since 1942, to children who'd grown up in his absence, to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The camp quartermaster issued departure supplies, clean clothing, basic toiletries, and a small food package for the journey. The Americans were methodical about the process, ensuring that prisoners left in decent condition. It would reflect poorly on the United States if emaciated Germans arrived in Europe after years in American custody. The attention to detail, the concern for appearances, was quintessentially American. Image mattered, international opinion mattered, the rules mattered. Hans boarded a Liberty ship at Norfolk in May 1946, reversing the journey he'd made 3 years earlier. The ship was crowded with repatriated prisoners, men from camps across America converging on the East Coast for transport home. They were quieter than they'd been on the westbound journey. The intervening years had worn away the arrogance, the certainty, the faith in German invincibility that had sustained them through capture. The food aboard ship was adequate, but not abundant. The war was over, and the special treatment had ended. Men received sufficient rations, nothing more. It was enough. After years of American plenty, even reduced portions felt comfortable. But Hans noticed the difference, the subtle reminder that they were no longer prisoners of war governed by Geneva Convention protocols. They were defeated enemies being returned to a defeated nation. The crossing took 2 weeks. Hans spent hours on deck, watching the Atlantic pass beneath grey skies. He talked with other prisoners, men trying to prepare themselves for what awaited. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, painted grim pictures. Cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, the economy collapsed. Food shortages were worse than anything during the war. The Marshall Plan had been announced. American aid to rebuild Europe. But implementation was still being debated in Washington. A Panzer mechanic from Munich stood at the rail beside Hans one evening, smoking one of the last American cigarettes from his carefully hoarded supply. The mechanic had worked in the camp motor pool, maintaining American vehicles, learning American mechanical standards. He was 23 years old and looked 40. "What do we tell them?" the mechanic asked. "When they ask what it was like, what do we say? That we ate steak while they starved? That we gained weight while they buried their children? How do you explain that you were treated well by the enemy?" Hans had no answer. The question haunted every prisoner facing repatriation. The truth felt like betrayal. They'd been complicit in their own survival by surrendering, by accepting American generosity, by failing to resist unto death as propaganda had demanded. They'd chosen to live, and that choice had been rewarded with abundance while the Twer, faithful, suffered. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in late May. The port was a wasteland. Buildings reduced to shells. Cranes twisted by bombing. The dock workers were gaunt, moving with the careful slowness of malnourished people conserving energy. Hans descended the gangway and stepped onto German soil for the first time in 4 years. The contrast was immediate and visceral. The air smelled of coal, smoke, and sewage. Garbage littered the streets because there was no functioning sanitation service. People in threadbare clothing shuffled through the rubble, searching for anything salvageable. This was the heart of what had been the Third Reich, and it looked like the end of civilization. American military government officials processed the returning prisoners in a commandeered warehouse. They checked documentation, verified identities, provided release papers and ration cards. The ration cards were startling in their stinginess: bread, potatoes, occasional vegetables. Meat was listed as a weekly allocation of 200 grams, but the official stamping the card told Hans not to expect it to be available. The infrastructure to distribute meat rations didn't exist anymore. Hans received travel papers for Stuttgart. The journey that would have taken 4 hours by train before the war now required 3 days. The rail lines had been bombed repeatedly, the rolling stock destroyed, the stations reduced to rubble. Passengers travelled in freight cars when they travelled at all. Most walked. He walked. Carrying a small duffel bag with his possessions, Hans joined the streams of refugees, displaced persons, and demobilized soldiers trudging along ruined roads toward uncertain destinations. The landscape was lunar, villages destroyed, fields cratered, bridges blown. The systematic destruction wrought by Allied bombing had been even more thorough than he'd imagined from the safety of Colorado. Other former prisoners walked the same roads. They recognized each other by the relatively good condition of their clothing, the healthier appearance of men who'd been fed adequately for years. Civilians viewed them with mixed emotions. Some showed relief that their men had survived. Others displayed resentment that these soldiers had eaten American food while families starved. The returning POWs learned quickly not to discuss their treatment in captivity. The truth was too painful for those who'd endured. Hans reached Stuttgart after 4 days of walking. The city was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The aircraft factories where he'd worked before the war were twisted metal and broken concrete. The beautiful Baroque buildings of the city center were gone. Stuttgart had been a target throughout the war, bombed repeatedly by American and British aircraft. The destruction was comprehensive. He found his street by memory and landmarks that no longer existed. His apartment building had been damaged, but was still partially standing. The ground floor was a burned-out shell, but the upper floors showed signs of habitation. He climbed the stairs, his heart hammering, and knocked on the door of what had been his home. His wife opened the door. She was 41 years old and looked 60. Gaunt, grey-haired, wearing a dress made from repurposed curtain fabric. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, strangers connected by a shared past that felt like a different lifetime. Then she embraced him, and Hans felt her bones through the thin fabric. She weighed perhaps 40 kilograms, maybe less. Starvation had carved her into someone he barely recognized. His children appeared behind her. His daughter was 14, born in 1932, old enough to remember him but young enough that 3 years had transformed her from child to young woman. His son was 11, and Hans realized with a shock that the boy had no real memory of him. He'd left when his son was 7. The intervening years had been spent with his father as an absence, a photograph, an idea. They sat in the apartment's remaining furnished room and attempted conversation. His wife had prepared tea, though it was made from roasted acorns rather than actual tea leaves. She served it in chipped cups, apologizing for the lack of sugar. Hans looked at the brown liquid and thought about the sugar that sat in open bowls at Camp Carson, unlimited and free. He didn't mention it. Couldn't mention it. She asked the questions. Wives asked. Was he hurt? Was he treated well? Did he receive her letters? Hans answered carefully. Yes. He was uninjured. Yes. The Geneva Convention was observed. Yes. He'd received some letters, though many had been lost or delayed. He didn't elaborate, didn't describe the steak dinners, or the ice cream, or the Coca-Cola. To speak of abundance to someone who measured their family's survival in breadcrumbs would have been obscene. His wife told him what the years had cost, the bombing raids that came every few weeks, the hours in shelters, listening to explosions that shook the earth, the fires that consumed entire blocks, the dead neighbors, the injured friends, the constant hunger that ground people down more thoroughly than the bombs. She told him about the children's illnesses, the lack of medicine, the desperate expedients that mothers employed to keep their families alive. She told him about the final months of the war, when the Nazi authorities had conscripted every able-bodied male from 14 to 60 for the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch defense force. Boys his son's age had been handed rifles and told to stop American tanks. Most had died, some had simply deserted and hidden. His son had been spared only because of his age, and because his mother had hidden him when the Nazi party officials came recruiting. She told him about the arrival of French occupation forces in Stuttgart, the new masters who governed with regulations and ration cards. The Americans controlled the overall occupation zone, but they'd assigned Stuttgart to the French administration. The French were less generous than the Americans, she said, more bitter about German occupation, more interested in extracting reparations than in rebuilding. Hans listened and understood that his wife and children had fought a different war than he had. They'd endured years of systematic deprivation while he'd lived in heated barracks with flush toilets and regular meals. The guilt that had haunted him in America intensified into something physical, a crushing weight that made breathing difficult. He'd survived by surrendering, and his survival had been comfortable while they'd suffered for remaining free. His wife seemed to sense his thoughts. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her emaciation. "You're alive," she said. "That's what matters. We're all alive. We can rebuild." Her pragmatism, forged in years of impossible choices, cut through his guilt. She was right. Survival was the foundation from which everything else could be constructed. They were alive. They were together. The apartment was damaged but habitable. They had ration cards and papers. It was more than many families had. Over the following weeks, Hans began the difficult process of reintegration. He registered with the occupation authorities, received an employment card, and started looking for work. Stuttgart's infrastructure was slowly recovering. The occupation government had established food distribution centres, medical clinics, and work programs. The Marshall Plan aid was beginning to flow. American resources applied to the task of rebuilding the country that American bombers had destroyed. Hans found work in a machine shop, repairing equipment for the reconstruction effort. His technical skills, the same abilities that had made him valuable to the Panzer Corps, were now applied to fixing tractors and construction equipment. The pay was minimal, denominated in occupation currency that had uncertain value. But work meant ration supplements, additional food allocations for labourers engaged in reconstruction. He worked alongside other former soldiers, men who'd returned from the Eastern Front, from Italy, from France. They didn't talk much about the war. The shame was too pervasive, the defeat too comprehensive. Germany had launched a war of conquest and racial extermination, and it had ended with unconditional surrender and occupation. There was no honour in it, no glory, only the grinding work of surviving the peace. But sometimes, during breaks, the men would talk quietly about their experiences as prisoners. Those who'd been captured by the Soviets told horror stories of starvation, forced labour, and casual brutality. Millions of German soldiers had been marched into Soviet captivity, and hundreds of thousands had died there. The survivors returned years later, broken men carrying physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Those who'd surrendered to the British described adequate treatment, generally in line with Geneva Convention standards. The British had limited resources but maintained basic humanity. Prisoners were housed, fed reasonably, and eventually repatriated. Those who'd surrendered to the Americans described something different. Not just adequate treatment, but abundance. Food that exceeded Wehrmacht standards. Infrastructure that surpassed German military installations. The casual plenty that had characterized American POW camps. When these men spoke, others listened with expressions mixing envy and disbelief. It sounded like fantasy, like propaganda in reverse. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Men who'd been American prisoners were healthier, better fed, less damaged than those who'd endured captivity elsewhere. Hans rarely spoke about his 3 years at Camp Carson. When he did, he downplayed the abundance, emphasizing the work details and the separation from family. But he couldn't entirely hide the truth. His physical condition revealed it. At 43 years old, after years of war and captivity, he was healthier than men who'd remained free in Germany. One evening in the machine shop, a foreman who'd spent 2 years in Soviet captivity confronted him directly. "You were in America," the foreman said. "My cousin was there too. Said they had ice cream, said they could buy Coca-Cola. Was that true?" Hans looked at the man's skeletal frame, the missing teeth from scurvy, the tremor in his hands from permanent nerve damage caused by malnutrition. He thought about the machine that churned ice cream on the 4th of July, the bottles of Coke that cost a nickel at the camp canteen. He thought about the lie he could tell, the way he could minimize or deny the abundance. Instead, he told the truth. Yes, it was true. The Americans fed us well, better than our own army fed us, better than Germany fed its civilians during the war. They had resources we couldn't match. That's why they won. The foreman absorbed this information silently. Then he nodded slowly. My cousin said the same thing. Said we never had a chance. Not because we weren't good soldiers, but because they had everything and we had nothing. The whole war was a lie built on pretending we were stronger than we were. This became an uncomfortable consensus among the men rebuilding Germany. The war had been lost not in 1945, but in 1939, before it even started. The disparity in resources had been so vast that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome it. The Americans and Soviets could sustain losses that would have broken the Wehrmacht. They could replace destroyed equipment faster than Germany could build new equipment. They could feed their armies and their civilians simultaneously. The Nazi propaganda about American weakness had been a lie, but it was a lie that served a purpose. If German soldiers had known the truth about Fehlermannstation, American industrial capacity, they might have refused to fight. The illusion of superiority had been necessary to maintain morale, to keep men fighting in a war that was mathematically unwinnable. Hans's daughter asked him about the war one evening in the summer of 1946. She was preparing for school, or what passed for school in occupied Stuttgart. The French administration had reopened educational facilities with carefully vetted teachers and denazified curriculum. She had questions about the war her history teacher couldn't or wouldn't answer. "Did you know?" she asked. "About the camps? About what they did to the Jews?" Hans had dreaded this conversation. He chose his words carefully. "I heard rumours. During the war, there were whispers about camps in the east where people were sent. I thought it was propaganda, allied lies to make us look evil. Then the Americans made us watch films of what they found. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. It wasn't propaganda, it was real." His daughter processed this information with the stark clarity of youth. "So we were the bad ones. Not the Americans, not the British. Us." "Yes," Hans said. "We were the bad ones." The admission cost him something, a final surrender of the illusions that had sustained him through the war. But it was necessary. The next generation needed to know the truth, unvarnished and uncomfortable. Germany had committed atrocities. Germany had started a war of aggression. Germany had been defeated by nations that, whatever their flaws, had maintained basic human decency even toward their enemies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The years that followed were difficult, but not hopeless. The Marshall Plan delivered American aid on a scale that gradually stabilized the German economy. Food became more available. Infrastructure was rebuilt. The occupation gradually relaxed as Germany demonstrated its commitment to democratic governance. The lessons learned in captivity, the proof that democracy and abundance could coexist, shaped the reconstruction. Hans kept working in the machine shop. His technical skills, the same precision that had maintained Panzer tanks, now built the machinery of peace. He trained apprentices, young men who'd been children during the war. He taught them the importance of quality work, of meeting standards, of building things that lasted. And sometimes, when the moment was right, he told them about America. Not the America of Nazi propaganda, weak and decadent, the real America he'd witnessed, the nation that could afford to give ice cream to its enemies, the society that had production capacity so vast it could fight wars on multiple continents while maintaining civilian abundance, the democracy that treated prisoners according to rules even when rage and revenge would have been emotionally satisfying. "They beat us with food," Hans told one apprentice, in 1949. "Not with cruelty, but with casual generosity. They showed us that everything we'd been taught was a lie, that democracy could be strong, that racial equality didn't mean weakness, that mercy could be a weapon more powerful than terror." The apprentice was 17, too young to remember the war clearly. He listened with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a world that had ended before he could experience it. "Do you think we can be like that?" he asked. "Like the Americans?" Hans considered the question. Around him, Stuttgart was rebuilding. New buildings rising from rubble, factories reopening. People are starting to believe that the future might be better than the past. The economic miracle was beginning, fueled by American aid and German labor. "I don't know if we can be like the Americans," Hans said finally. "But we can learn from them. We can build a Germany that doesn't make the same mistakes, a Germany that remembers what happens. When lies replace truth, when propaganda replaces reality, when ideology replaces humanity." He thought about the Coca-Cola he'd drunk at Camp Carson, the sweet, fizzy liquid that had tasted like the death of everything he'd believed. He thought about the steak dinners and the ice cream and the sugar in open bowls. He thought about his wife's emaciated frame when he'd returned home, the physical proof of the cost of German ideology. "They fed me well when they didn't have to," Hans said. "They treated me as a human being when they could have treated me as a monster. And that mercy accomplished what cruelty never could. It made me see the truth. That's the lesson we need to remember. That strength isn't about domination. It's about the capacity to be generous, even to those who don't deserve it. The apprentice nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom from a man who'd learned it through bitter experience. Around them, the machine shop hummed with the sounds of reconstruction. Germany was being rebuilt, not by the people who'd believed the lies, but by those who'd learned from their defeat. Hans Brenner lived until 1983. He saw West Germany become one of the world's great democracies. He saw the economic miracle transform his nation from ruins to prosperity. He saw his children grow up in a Germany that rejected everything the Third Reich had stood for. He told his story sparingly, usually only when asked, but he told it truthfully. In his final years, he corresponded with several men he'd met at Camp Carson. They'd become friends in captivity, and some had emigrated to America after the war. They sent him letters describing their lives in Colorado and Texas and Nebraska. They sent photographs of their families, of the American grandchildren who would never know the war that had defined their grandfathers' lives. One of these men, a former Luftwaffe pilot who'd become an engineer in Denver, wrote to Hans in 1982. "Do you remember that? First Coca-Cola?" the letter asked. "The one we bought at the camp, PX, for a nickel? I think about that bottle sometimes. How it was the moment everything we'd been taught revealed itself as fiction. One bottle of soda, 5 cents, and an entire worldview collapsed." Hans remembered. He would remember until the day he died. The condensation on the glass, the fizz of carbonation, the sweet, sharp taste that spoke of abundance and industrial precision, and a society so confident in its power that it could afford to be generous to its enemies. That bottle of Coca-Cola, purchased for 5 cents at a prison camp in Colorado, had taught Hans Brenner more about power and strength and the nature of victory than all the Nazi propaganda he'd ever heard. It had shown him that true power wasn't the ability to destroy, but the capacity to create so much that even the enemy could be fed. That true strength wasn't racial purity and military conquest, but industrial abundance and systematic generosity. The men who'd surrendered at Tunisia in May 1943 had expected torture and starvation. Instead, they'd received steak and ice cream and the education of abundance. They'd learned that the America of Nazi propaganda didn't exist. The real America was stronger, wealthier, and more generous than anything Joseph Goebbels had prepared them for. And that reality, served 3 times daily on metal trays in prison camps across America, had accomplished what battlefield defeats could not. It had shattered the myth of German superiority. It had demolished the lie of American weakness. It had proven, through the simple mathematics of calories and production, that the war had been lost before it began. Hans Brenner's story was one of hundreds of thousands. Former prisoners scattered across Germany, living with the knowledge that they'd been defeated not by cruelty but by abundance, not by terror but by generosity. They carried that knowledge into the reconstruction, into the economic miracle, into the building of a new Germany that learned from the bitter lessons of the old. The ice cream and Coca-Cola weren't just food and drink. They were proof that everything the Reich had promised was a lie, proof that democracy could be strong and totalitarianism weak, proof that the future belonged to those who could build and create, not those who could only destroy and conquer. And that proof, served daily in American prison camps, helped transform Germany from the nation that had started the war into the nation that learned from its defeat. A bitter education, purchased at the cost of millions of lives. But an education that took root and grew into something better than what had come before. The taste of that 5-cent Coca-Cola lingered for a lifetime. The memory of abundance when starvation had been promised. The shock of mercy when cruelty had been expected. The education that came not from propaganda or ideology, but from the simple, undeniable reality of who could feed their people and who could not. That was the lesson of the German POWs in America. Not a story of battlefield heroics or military strategy, but a quieter truth about how wars are won and ideologies are defeated. Sometimes victory comes not from the sword, but from the capacity to show mercy. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is not a bomb, but a bottle of Coca-Cola offered to an enemy who expected to die.